Like those 10 fundamental principles.
Oh, God.
Yeah, the ones that kind of secretly rule the world, right?
Mm.
I mean, I gotta say, these course notes you sent, they're already blowing my mind. Even something as simple as buying a cup of coffee is like way more economically complex than I ever imagined.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how these principles are like, once you start understanding them, it's like a secret decoder ring to like everyday decisions, even government policies. It's all connected. And it all really begins with this one little word: scarcity.
Scarcity, okay. I get that it, means we can't have everything we want, but is that really the like foundation of all economics? It seems a bit, well, kind of gloomy.
Yeah, maybe a tad gloomy, but also incredibly motivating if you think about it. Even things that we consider abundant, like water, for example, become scarce in certain situations. I mean, just imagine a bottle of water in the desert or during a drought. Suddenly, that bottle becomes super valuable.
Right. So scarcity actually creates value.
Wow.
And that's why we have to make choices. Speaking of choices, the notes mention this cool visual called the circular flow diagram, I think.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a map, right? Showing how money and resources kind of move around.
Precisely. It's a really neat way to visualize how households, meaning like you and me, we provide labor and resources to firms, which are basically businesses.
Oh.
And then in return, we get paid. And then we use that money to buy the goods and services that those firms produce.
Okay, so it's this constant flow, almost like breathing in and out. Our work fuels the economy and the economy sustains us.
Exactly.
I like that.
And it helps you see how like all these choices you make have ripple effects. So when you buy your latte, that keeps the coffee shop going, right?
Yeah.
Which then supports their employees, who in turn spend their earnings somewhere else.
Whoa, okay. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It really is.
So scarcity forces us to make choices, right? But how do we even begin to decide what to prioritize? The notes mentioned something called opportunity cost. And I don't know about you, but I'm definitely feeling that.
Yeah, that feeling of missing out.
Ugh. Tell me about it.
But it's more than just a feeling, though. It's a key economic principle. Because every single decision we make, from the small ones to the big ones, has an opportunity cost. Because at the end of the day, resources are limited. So choosing one path, whatever that path may be, always means giving up another one.
So even right now, choosing to do this deep dive instead of, say, cleaning my apartment, that has an opportunity cost. I'm giving up a sparkling clean living room for economic knowledge. Is that right?
Precisely. That's exactly it.
Well, hopefully this knowledge is worth the trade-off.
I think so, but then that brings up another question. How do we even make those trade-offs rationally? And that's where thinking at the margin comes in.
Ooh, okay, that sounds interesting. I remember that phrase from the notes. But what does it actually mean to think at the margin?
It essentially means to focus on making those small changes rather than all or nothing decisions.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, should I drink coffee all day? You ask yourself, do I want one more cup?
Okay, so like weighing the benefit of an extra caffeine boost against the cost, like potential jitters or just, how much it costs.
Yeah, exactly. We're always comparing something economists call marginal benefit, so that's like the extra satisfaction from that one more cup, to the marginal cost, so the extra expense or downside.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. It's like a tiny cost-benefit analysis for every little decision we make. I'm guessing like businesses use this too, right?
Of course, all the time.
Like deciding to stay open an extra hour or produce one more unit.
They're always trying to figure out if that next unit makes sense. Maximizing their profits by evaluating those marginal costs and benefits.
Fascinating.
Which brings us to another super powerful force that really shapes all of our decisions. Incentives.
Ah, yes, incentives. That's like the classic carrot and stick, right? Higher prices incentivize me to buy less, which is why I'm such a sucker for a good sale,
Oh, yeah, we've all been there. But incentives go way beyond just, individual choices. They actually affect how whole markets function. For example, I think your notes had an interesting example about seatbelt laws.
Oh, yeah, right. The one where, seatbelts obviously save lives.
Yeah.
But they might encourage some drivers to get a little reckless. Because they feel like, hey, I've got this extra layer of protection.
Yeah, it's like a classic example of unintended consequences. You create an incentive to make things safer. But then it might actually lead to riskier behavior somewhere else. It really shows how complex and interconnected these principles truly are.
I'm starting to realize that economics isn't just about, dry numbers and theories. It's actually about psychology, about human behavior, about all these push and pull forces.
You got it. And we've really only just scratched the surface here.
All right, I'm ready for more. We talked about scarcity, that circular flow, opportunity cost, thinking at the margin, and of course those incentives. So what other economic mysteries are hiding in these notes?
Well, next up, we've got a concept that honestly gets a bit of a bad rap. Trade. It's often portrayed as this like cutthroat competition, with winners and losers. But I think it's way more nuanced than that, don't you?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's not about like one country taking advantage of another. It's more about, well, my notes here mention something called comparative advantage.
Right. Comparative advantage.
What exactly is that?
So basically, it's the idea that even if one country is more efficient at producing everything, it still makes sense for them to specialize in what they're best at and then trade with other countries for the rest. It's kind of like, think about it this way. Even if you were, like, the world's best baker, it wouldn't make sense to bake all your own bread, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Especially if that meant you couldn't do this awesome podcast.
Right. I'd much rather trade my podcasting skills for a delicious loaf of sourdough any day. So basically, countries are kind of like people. They specialize based on what they're good at, and everyone benefits.
Exactly. And that specialization leads to greater efficiency and overall prosperity because it allows each country to, produce more of what they're good at.
Gotcha. Okay. Starting to see how trade can be a win-win, but where does all this trading actually happen? I doubt we're still, like, bartering chickens for haircuts.
Not usually, no. Most modern trade happens in markets.
Ooh, markets. When I hear that word, I kind of picture, like, those crazy stock exchange floors of people yelling and waving their arms around,
Oh, yeah. There's definitely a lot of energy in financial markets. But essentially, markets are just places where buyers and sellers come together to exchange goods and services or resources, And you'd be surprised. Despite all the apparent chaos, they're actually really good at coordinating economic activity.
Wow. Okay, so how do these markets actually, work? What sets the prices of things?
Well, that's where this famous concept of the invisible hand comes into play. It's the idea that, when individuals act in their own self-interest, and that self-interest is guided by prices, it can lead to a really efficient and beneficial system overall, surprisingly.
Hold on. Are you saying that everyone acting in their own best interest can actually create a system that works for everyone?
Yeah.
That sounds almost too good to be true.
I know, right? It's one of the most powerful insights in economics. Let's think about that baker again, for example. They want to sell bread at a price that covers their costs and makes them a profit, right?
Makes sense.
But they've also got to compete with all the other bakers out there.
So if their bread is too expensive, people just go buy it somewhere else. So competition actually keeps prices in check.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it also incentivizes the baker to produce high-quality bread, stuff that people actually want to buy.
And on the flip side, I'm the consumer, so I'm always looking for the best bread at the best price. My own self-interest drives me to find those good deals.
It's like this amazing dance between buyers and sellers, and prices are the music,
I love that analogy.
And this dance plays out in markets all over the world, from farmers markets to online retailers. It's everywhere.
Okay, this invisible hand thing is really blowing my mind. But if markets are so good at self-regulating, why do we need governments to get involved in the economy at all?
That's a great question, and it brings us to our next principle, government's role. So while markets are generally really efficient, they're not perfect, Sometimes that invisible hand needs a little nudge in the right direction.
Interesting. So when do markets fail, and how can governments actually help?
Well, one classic example is pollution, right? Let's say a factory pollutes a river, which harms the environment and potentially people's health. That's what economists call an externality. It's basically a cost that's imposed on someone who's not directly involved in the transaction.
Okay, so the factory is making a profit, but they're not really factoring in the full cost of what they're doing. Someone else ends up paying the price, literally.
Exactly. And that's where governments can step in. They can impose regulations like pollution limits, or maybe even taxes to discourage those harmful behaviors.
So governments can be like referees, making sure everyone's playing by the rules and that no one's getting an unfair advantage.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And governments can also play a role in promoting equality. Even in a well-functioning market, there will always be some level of inequality. Some people will just have more resources, more opportunities. And governments can try to address that through things like taxes and welfare programs to create a more level playing field,
Right, so the government has to walk this tightrope between letting markets do their thing, but also stepping in when things get out of hand. Finding that balance must be incredibly difficult.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's an ongoing debate,
Yeah.
about what the optimal role of government in the economy actually is. But for now, let's shift gears a little and talk about something that affects all of us very directly, our living standards. Why are some countries so much richer than others?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Does it all boil down to just, like, working hard?
Hard work is definitely a part of it, but the main factor is something called productivity. So basically, how much a worker can produce with a certain amount of resources.
Okay, so it's about working smarter, not just harder. Kind of seeing a theme here.
Yeah, you got it. And that's where things like technology, education, and just the overall stability and efficiency of a country's institutions come into play. Like a country with a highly educated workforce, access to the latest tech, and a stable political system, well, they're likely to be more productive and therefore wealthier.
That makes me wonder about my own productivity. Maybe I should learn to code after all.
Investing in yourself is never a bad idea. But before you jump into that coding boot camp, we need to tackle one last economic mystery that's been lurking in the shadows of our conversation: inflation. Why does it feel like everything's getting more expensive all the time?
Ugh, don't even get me started on inflation. It's like my money is slowly but surely losing its superpowers.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It can feel like that. Basically, inflation is just a general increase in prices across the economy. And when the government prints too much money, the value of each dollar drops. And you need more dollars to buy the same stuff.
So it's like a giant game of hot potato. If everyone suddenly has twice as much money, they're going to try to buy more things. But there's only so much stuff to go around, so prices go up and our money buys less.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. And trying to manage inflation, that's one of the biggest challenges for policymakers, because it's actually closely tied to another really important factor: unemployment.
Wait, hold on. How are inflation and unemployment connected?
It might seem counterintuitive, but sometimes efforts to reduce inflation can lead to higher unemployment and vice versa.
Whoa, really? So trying to fix one problem could actually make the other one worse.
It's a really tricky balancing act, for sure. But that's a story for our final act, so stay tuned.
Okay, so let's get back to this inflation-unemployment thing. You were saying that trying to fix one could make the other worse. How does that even work?
Well, imagine the economy is booming. Right, unemployment's low, people are spending, businesses are doing great. But all that demand can actually push prices up, and then you've got inflation.
Right, more money going after the same amount of goods and services. It's like that classic supply and demand thing.
Exactly. So to combat that inflation, the government might try to cool things down a little. Like they could raise interest rates, which makes it more expensive for businesses to borrow money and invest.
Ah, I see. So then businesses might slow down their hiring or even like lay off workers to save money.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's a possibility. And that's the trade-off, right? Sometimes trying to lower inflation can lead to more unemployment, at least in the short term. It's a tough decision for policymakers to make.
Wow, that's a real catch-22, isn't it? So why can't we just have low inflation and low unemployment all the time? Seems like that would be the ideal situation.
I wish it were that simple. But the economy is, well, it's complex, to say the least. It's constantly being affected by all sorts of things, like global pandemics or sudden jumps in oil prices, even just changes in how confident people are feeling about the economy. All those things can throw things off balance.
So it's not always the government's fault if the economy's not doing well.
Not necessarily, no. They definitely have tools to try and influence things, but they can't control every single variable. It's more about navigating all those complexities and trying to, steer the ship in the right direction.
I'm starting to get a sense of just how tricky it is to make economic policy. It's almost like trying to solve this giant puzzle, but the puzzle pieces are always changing.
That's a great analogy, but thankfully our job isn't to solve that puzzle. Our job is to try and understand those basic principles so we can make better, more informed choices in our own lives.
Which brings us back to those 10 principles we've been talking about. They really are the keys to understanding how this whole economic world works, aren't they?
They really are. From scarcity and opportunity cost to that circular flow and the invisible hand of the market, these principles give us a framework for understanding the forces that shape our lives every single day.
I feel like I've learned so much today. I'm definitely going to look at things differently now. Even buying that latte feels like, I don't know, like a tiny reflection of the whole system.
Exactly. And remember, these 10 principles are just the beginning. Economics is a vast and fascinating field. There's always something new to discover.
That's true. It feels like we've just peeked behind the curtain, but there's a whole world back there.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, remember that every decision you make, from that morning coffee to your career, it's all part of this incredible economic tapestry.
Well said. Thanks so much for walking us through this deep dive. It's been eye-opening. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.